the event's going to start now. I'm Risham. I work for ICOP. ICOP is SARS's Implementing Corridors for Power project. We run a series of events at the university and at Westminster. We've been running a Palestine series. We've done various events, such as the targeting of Palestinian journalists, accountability on the war in Gaza. And today's event, we're also going to be covering Ecocide in Palestine. Today's event will be chaired by Dr. Dajani, who I'm going to pass on to now, who will introduce herself and the rest of the panel.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. And thank you so much for being here with us today. It's an honor to be chairing this event. And I thank Wissam, of course, for getting us all together for organizing this event. The way we're going to be splitting the time in a way where we're going to hear from each of the speakers for 7 minutes each. And we've got also Yasmeen online. And then we are going to start just a bit of a more conversational dialogue between us for a short bit as well, and then we'll open it up for discussions. So we're looking forward to be in conversation with you as well. Of course, today we are coming together, but we're also the urgency of the moment of genocide is, of course, the center of our attention. We have been witnessing this televised genocide for so long, and we feel both helpless, traumatized, and we also see a lot of fig leaves have been totally exposed in terms of discourses around international law, about warfare, and so many other things. When it comes to environment, it's also been a topic of concern for many of us who work in the field, but who also live and have Palestine close to heart. Much has been said, as you know, about the genocide having multiple forms, including forms of ecocide, which is describing the multifaceted violence inflicted on the besieged Gaza Strip throughout this ongoing genocide since October. And we wanted to put that in perspective here today when we speak about ecocide, that we are not really framing it or characterizing it as an event, as part of a specific moment in time, but we also wanted to situate it in a long-term systematic process of the erasure, denial of Palestinian presence on the land that Israel, as a settler colonial project, has been inflicting on Palestinians, whether in the fragmented geographies of Palestine today and even in the diaspora as well. And I think this is really important because speaking about the environment can mean different things to different people. So I'm really so honored to be in conversation with great speakers today who are going to bring their own perspective from their work and expertise. And we're going to start with Sarona. I wanted to give you the space to do the presentation first, and then we're going to do one by one. And then I'll have also some remarks to close. So yeah, if we start there, and then I'll be able to discussions. And then, yeah, please go ahead.
You're over there. Okay.
And please tell me when to stop talking.
Yeah, understand.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you to other speakers and co-panelists. It's really, really important that we're all doing this together and taking part in this. So just to give you an overview of Makan, the organization that I work for, we're a Palestinian-led educational organization. We do transformative educational trainings and develop resources to build your knowledge around Palestine holistically, but also do communications trainings. So if you're interested in any of that, just come chat to me afterwards. But today, for the next 5 to 7 minutes or so, what we're going to be looking at is hopefully what I'll be doing is just providing a foundation for understanding the narrative and the conversation around Palestine, so we have an accurate framing for when we're talking about the climate crisis, but the ways in which that Israeli settler colonial violence perpetuates the climate crisis. So we're just going to skip over a few slides. But one of the main things I wanted to kind of start off with is understanding the main misconceptions about Palestine. So it's often viewed as something that's a conflict, something that's an age-old religious feud, that it's too complex to understand, or that it's exceptional. So oftentimes, the climate crisis is often the ways in which that people approach the climate crisis when it comes to Palestine is through this lens. And I think something that is our responsibility into understanding this accurately is understanding that actually, how do I click on it? Oh, thank you so much. I don't know how to use any computer. Is what we want to emphasize instead is that actually this is an anti-colonial struggle, that land is at the root of the struggle, and that it's a complex structure of policies with a simple structure, with a simple story of oppression. So in other words, you don't need to be Edward Said in order to understand Palestine, to advocate for Palestinian liberation, but also to understand Palestine as a struggle that's for climate justice and climate reparations. And kind of the main kind of things that I want to take us through very quickly is just understanding the territory of historic Palestine, because it's really important that as we're moving throughout the discussion today, we remind ourselves that the ways in which that Palestinian land and people are fragmented is through artificial borders. And what we're going to be looking through today is, and kind of what I want you all to be thinking about, is at what expense have these borders been created on, and in what ways is Israel's structure of colonial oppression, how is that coming at the expense of all living things from the river to the sea when we're talking about the territory of Palestine. And of course, this takes us to really understanding Zionism. So political Zionism is a political movement that was created in the late 1800s as a response to European anti-Semitism. And it's gaining momentum, and it was gaining momentum by drawing inspiration from European settler colonial movements around the globe. So it's premised on the understanding, or the idea that it conceptualized that anti-Semitism within Europe couldn't be fought. So the only solution was for a nation state to be made exclusively for Jewish people via colonization. So in other words, a colonial ethno-state. And just to make it clear, like Theodor Herzl in 1896, who's considered the founding thinker of modern Zionism, wrote in one of his manifestos, "If I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish it before I construct." So thinking about that being kind of political framing then helps us understand actually the ways in which inherently, when we're thinking about the destruction of Palestinian land and all living things, political Zionism is the underpinning to that. And this takes us through the kind of main foundational understanding, which is that of settler colonialism. So the practice of what Herzl really eloquently put in his own way, the demolishment before he can construct. This practice is a key feature of settler colonialism. So a really helpful way of understanding that, and a definition that we can always rely on, is that provided by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang, who define it as different from other forms of colonialism, in that settlers come with the intention of making a new home on the land. It is a homemaking that insists on settler sovereignty over all things in their new domain. Settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. So why is it really important for us to start off with this when we're moving into a conversation about the ways in which that Israel perpetuates the climate crisis? Because what this shows us is, by understanding and having an accurate framing of Israeli policy, is that it tells us that the indigenous are not just the people who are racialized on the land, but it is all the living things that are then constituted as indigenous and therefore a threat. So when we're moving into understanding the policies against water, resources, plants, the criminalization of those uses, that cannot be separated from Israeli settler colonialism. That is inherently part and parcel of the settler colonial machine and its project. And I'll wrap up in the next minute and a half.
Yeah, that's exactly what you have.
Wallah, that's And so through basically, when we're moving through today, through our time together, through political, social, and economic institutions, Israeli settler supremacy has been and continues to be built at the expense of indigenous Palestinian land and life. So in other words, what's not being disputed is Jewish presence and contributions to Palestinian society historically and today. What is being disputed are the conditions upon which Israel and Israelis are able to be in Palestine, which is through the maintenance of a settler colonial ethno-state by destroying Palestinian land, life, ideas, and culture. And we can see this materially from the shrinking space provided by the Visualizing Palestine graphic on your right side. And this is juxtaposed to a graphic that was provided in the Tuck and Yang article, showing the US as a key example. So really with settler colonialism, a key feature throughout it, no matter the context, is the division of land and the division of people and the exploitation of all living things on that land. And lastly, just to wrap this up, a helpful way to thinking about everything that we're going to be talking about today is the objectives of Zionist policy, because I think is something that Israel does really effectively, is actually throw so many different policies in its complex regime of control that it really confuses people. And so what I would recommend us thinking about is how Israel wants the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians on it, or it wants the maximum amount of Palestinians on the minimum amount of land. And Gaza, for example, is kind of the most true and ultimate expression of that. So also just one last thing before I wrap up is to say that we cannot divorce this conversation nor our practices towards climate reparations from the genocide that's happening in Gaza, nor of the ongoing and intensifying colonial policies impacting Palestinians, not just across historic Palestine, but also those of us in exile. And then I just want to say, this man in the photo, his name is Haj Suleiman from Al Khair, which is one of the West Bank villages that grazes in the area of Ain al-Bayda, and he's protesting Israeli settlement development in 2021. So again, just kind of wanting to show you that land is the central component of our fight for liberation. So I'll just stop there because we've got Yasmeen and Mohammed and everyone else to hear from, but hopefully that just provides us kind of a departure for the kind of accurate discourse point when we're talking about everything else. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sarona. And I think you've done a brilliant job in kind of really debunking somehow the myth and kind of confronting the reality that we no longer kind of tolerate or accept to think of Palestine as a site of conflict. And I think kind of going beyond that, or like stopping to kind of go into conversation and arguments around the fact that it's a conflict and what does a conflict, a Palestinian-Israeli conflict look like. I think it's kind of from a justice perspective, it is the right thing to do. And also kind of framing settler colonialism in that case, that is evidently a structure that has been ongoing in Palestine since 1948. So thank you for that. And where you stopped, Yasmeen, I think it's a great point to kind of center it around land and kind of to examine the West Bank also and beyond as sites where land is at the central heart of people's Palestinian struggle to remain. So we will be hearing from Yasmeen, who is going to be telling us a bit more, but focusing more on like food sovereignty, agroecology, and land politics as well. So Yasmeen, the floor is yours, and you've got 7 minutes, and I'll be letting you know when.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Can you all hear me first?
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful. First, I also want to apologize that my camera is off. I had an allergic reaction today and my face is very swollen. So you're not missing out on anything, I promise. But my name is Yasmeen El-Hasan. I am based in the West Bank of Palestine. I'm originally from a village in Jenin. And live in Ramallah now. I am the International Advocacy Coordinator with the Union of Agricultural Work Committees in Palestine, also known as UAC. UAC is a grassroots Palestinian civil society organization working to support the steadfastness of Palestinian farmers, fisher people, peasants, rural communities. We work to protect and defend Palestinian sovereignty in the face of the Israeli occupation and its dispossession of Palestinian land and natural resources. So we were founded by a group of volunteer agronomists in 1986, and since then have grown to work all across the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And our work includes very material and infrastructural work, such as land reclamation and rehabilitation, irrigation pipes and systems, agricultural roads and land, greenhouses, herding and herders, water wells, facilitation of cooperatives. We have an indigenous seed bank where we preserve over 60 types of indigenous seeds and so much more. And since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, we have been working on an emergency community aid project in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, where we have been able to gather, collect, and redistribute food to our communities, and also provide support to our forcibly displaced communities in the West Bank Area C. And we're also working on reconstructing some infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, such as water wells and returning to farming the land. So UAC has long been targeted by the occupation for our work on Palestinian land sovereignty. And we are one of the 7 quote unquote terrorist designated Palestinian civil society organizations that the Israeli occupation designated in 2021. And this criminalization of Palestinian civil society is just more of an exemplification and illustration of the existential threat that indigenous justice and environmental justice, land justice poses to a settler entity. So most of what I will be talking about will be relevant to food systems and food sovereignty. So I'll talk about those a little bit more broadly right now. And I'm very intentional when I say food sovereignty rather than food security. And that is because if we had sovereignty over our land and natural resources, we would be food secure. So as Sarona was talking about, Israel is a settler colony, and we know that settler colonialism eliminates forced displacement of an indigenous population of a land, and replacing them with the settler population. So we know that the basis of settler colonialism is land theft. It's all about the land. And as a settler colony, as the world has witnessed, and as we have lived through for nearly a century, a settler colony will do whatever it takes to forcibly take that land. And that includes destroying it, exploiting it, ruining its ecosystem, and genociding its people. And this Israeli settler colonial disruption of Palestinian food systems has been ongoing. It is a deliberate and calculated targeting of food systems that is systemically ingrained in settler colonialism, and that aims to dispossess the indigenous Palestinian population of their sustenance, livelihoods, and ultimately land. And so this targeting, disruption, destruction of these food systems are tactical strategy, attempting to sever the indigenous relationship with and interdependence on the land, no matter the consequences, whether they be humanitarian, like the tens of thousands of martyrs, or environmental, like the hundreds of thousands of metric tons of planet-warming emissions produced by Israel alone in the past few months, or the decades-long track record of environmental destruction. And so by deliberately destroying all infrastructure for self-sustenance and the land, the occupation is aiming to ensure that those who they do not massacre will be killed by starvation, dehydration, disease. Our struggle for food sovereignty is necessarily interconnected with our struggle for national sovereignty and self-determination. If we had sovereignty, again, over our land and natural resources, we would be food secure, as this population of 2.3 million would not be in famine, and our land would not be facing the climate crisis that it is at the moment. And we affirm food sovereignty as a guiding framework to liberation. In order to have food security, which is a basic right, there must be food sovereignty. In order to have food sovereignty, we must have indigenous sovereignty. So a free Palestine is a precursor and prerequisite to any sort of climate justice. They are inextricably linked. And I'll end just by talking about our relationship with the land. The Palestinian relationship with the land is not abstract. It is very material. We are very rooted in the land. Palestinian communities are intertwined with our ecosystem. And I don't say that as a metaphor or to be poetic, although it sounds very poetic, but quite literally, Palestinian communities are physically rooted in our land. Our relationship with this land is symbiotic. It's reciprocal, not just symbolic, not transactional. And it's not about what we get from the land, but about what we give to the land. And the Palestinian indigenous tradition of engagement with the land, which we can also refer to as agroecology, Palestinian agroecology, reflects this interdependence, this care. We are caretakers of our land. And so when the Israeli occupation attacks, destroys, steals our land, it's a calculated attempt at the destruction of indigenous livelihood, elimination of Palestinian communities via environmental destruction and ecocide. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all and the rest of my panelists. And thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Yasmeen, so much for this powerful intervention, and also like kind of battling with with your allergy. And so thank you so much, Salamtek. And such critical points there as well. And we're going to hear now from Mohammed, who is going to be speaking to us about another aspect of ecocide that actually kind of is part and parcel of colonial extractivism, and it kind of also ends up, being very material, being very much quantified as well. So it would be really great that we're hearing from so many different perspectives, whether also kind of from the material lived experience, but also kind of conceptually, what does it mean to live under a settler colonial structure, and what does it mean to live under like processes of intensified ecocide like we're witnessing today. So thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Mona. I feel really honored to be following two amazing speakers and to be in the company of such a brilliant panel of Palestinian speakers. It's actually a rare privilege to be on such a panel. So thank you. So yeah, my name is Mohammed Ghalaieny. I'm an atmospheric scientist. That's my specialty. I work on air pollution policy nationally in the UK, but I should probably emphasize that I'm speaking here in a personal capacity rather than the capacity of the role that I have professionally. So yeah, I'm from Gaza, and I'm going to talk today about, I guess, the situation in terms of air pollution in Gaza from not from a data-driven sense, but just from what we know to be occurring based on just mainly on the damage maps and also what we know about practices that are going on there. I'm actually going to start though by going back to 2005, because I think Sarona and also Yasmeen brought up the dispossession of the land, and I want to start with this map of Gaza in 2005 that just emphasizes that. So this is a map that shows different Israeli settlements that were taking up almost 40% of Gaza up until 2005. It was one of the great kind of myths of the Israeli occupation, that when they withdrew from Gaza in 2005, that they said that Gaza was liberated, but it was just a continuation of the occupation in a different way. But up until 2005, these settlements had around 10,000 residents, and they took up 40% of the land, the water, prime agricultural soil. And yeah, it's just a highlight of that. Now, if we move to the next map, this is Gaza now, 2024. This is a damage map that has been published in various places, and it used radar techniques or LiDAR techniques to assess how many buildings have been damaged. So the higher intensity of red, the more complete the damage is in certain areas. And as you can see, it's very focused around population centers. And I probably also hasten to add that this map predates it was from March this year, so it predates like the invasion of Rafah, predates the really heavy assault on Nusayrat and the recent reoccupation of Gaza. The reason I'm using this map is, as I said, the more intense the red, the more intense the destruction. The more intense the destruction, the more rubble. The more rubble there is, the more we have air pollutants. And I'm talking specifically about particulate matter, so small particles. And we'll touch later on other pollutants as well. But yeah, so each of these, each destroyed building becomes a source of pollutants. We have 40 million tons of rubble, and if you think of how much of that is fine rubble consisting of either heavy metals from bomb casings, asbestos fibers from some of the construction materials, concrete, and you start realizing what toxic mix of particulate matter people are inhaling in Gaza. And that's only the beginning of it, because in addition to the rubble, we also have people now burning waste, because waste management has all but broken down. There's not that much fuel for waste transportation, and so people are piling waste and burning it, and that again results in pollutants like polyaromatic hydrocarbons and other things that are quite a nasty mix. Then we add to that that Gaza is now really fueled. People don't have any gas to use and are burning solid fuels. And finally, people are also powering vehicles where they can with cooking oil. So the result is quite a mix that is resulting in quite toxic exposures. And we don't know the specific mix, but what we do know is when you have a mix of exposures, that actually in some ways increases the potential harm. I guess going from threats now to solutions. This is just I guess something that we use in environmental science. It's a source pathway receptor model. We just say, okay, how do we help people? How do we stop this? Well, we want to, stop the source getting to the receptor, and there's different. I need to mix up my slides now a little bit. Different solutions. So for example, in an ideal world, you'd use water-based dust suppression. You'd spray water around, and that would keep the dust down, less particulates. You'd restore the fuel supply, so you didn't have that solid fuel burning. You'd have fuel for waste management, etc. People would have dust masks, for example, and that would help stop their exposure. Now, all these are, I guess, technical solutions, but they're ultimately, going back to previous speakers, they're solutions that we wouldn't need if we didn't have an ongoing genocidal attack on Gaza and also the ongoing occupation. So that's kind of like ultimately the solution that, this is one of the streets in Gaza City. And yeah, just let's have these soldiers out of Gaza, let's end the occupation, and then give us environmental sovereignty to allow us to have a healthy, functioning environment. I'm not saying it was perfect before, nowhere is, but ultimately we need to be in control of that, not at the whims of an occupation. So I'm just gonna pop that. How much time have I got left? 2 minutes.
You've still got one and a half.
Okay.
1.5.
Right. So now we're going to talk a bit about international environmental law, but I just wanted to kind of put these up here. Maybe we can use them for discussion later. These are some of the frameworks that exist for the protection of the environment. The top one, PERAC, has 27 principles, and some of them are very applicable to the situation right now. They're not binding, but they're there. There's also the Red Cross have made guidelines for militaries in armed conflict, and there's also a really good volume from these two organizations on how to prevent harm in war situations. So that just some solutions. Obviously, we might talk later about like the fact that these exist, but what's the point in some way? Sorry. So very briefly, if now we are though in a situation where the occupation and genocide is ongoing, what can we do to make sure that people's the health effects and people suffering are recorded, I guess, for justice? And I think we need quite a lot of epidemiology to be done, both on individuals and like the environmental exposures. We need to do some studies on what the composition of particles are, so we can get an idea of the toxicological exposure, and then think of environmental assessment and rehabilitation and reparations. And this graphic just demonstrates different ways of exposure and different pollutants. I'm going to end with this slide, which is actually nothing to do with Gaza. It's actually two. First of all, I don't know if anyone recognizes the spraying of Agent Orange in Vietnam there in the 70s, that was found to be very connected to birth deformities in both children of Vietnamese civilians, but also children of veterans American veterans. And in the end, reparations were only made appropriately to veterans, and that took a lot of time. And reparations to the Vietnamese population took many, many years and were inadequate. And the slide at the bottom is from the occupation of Iraq, and what you see there is a burn pit where the US military was burning their solid waste. And again, that was then shown to have had a massive impact on the health of both troops and Iraqi civilians. And I think I'm just trying to use these as an example to kind of link what militaries end up doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, so much for this really eye-opening presentation. And I think it's also really good to have you here, because we usually end up sometimes talking not from hearing from an expertise perspective in terms of actual physical material aspects of what are the impacts of genocide, what are the impacts of war, and we'd be able to discuss it more. But I wanted to also take a few minutes to kind of also contribute a bit to the discussion by speaking a bit about the work that I do as well, and kind of also how did I also get to a point where I was also kind of thinking that the way we frame Palestine and the way we frame the environment in Palestine has been very much dominated by kind of a very Western perspective and confined to kind of ideas of a conflict. You know, this is an ongoing conflict, and you have two sides, and you need to work kind of to better the environment. And I remember that once we kind of speak about water, for example, in Palestine, we kind of confined it to speaking about water injustice in the West Bank, where evidently, if we look at numbers, we're looking at Israel controlling almost more than 80% of the resources of the West Bank in terms of the rich groundwater that's underneath our feet. But then stopping right there and saying, oh, this is very unjust. It's a water distribution issue. Is it a distributive justice, or is it much more than that? And I think this is where kind of thinking about the different fragmented geographies of Palestine is required, because not only do we see water injustice happening in the West Bank or in Gaza, which, by the way, also before the ongoing genocide, the situation in Gaza was really very catastrophic in terms of environmental degradation, but also in terms of water being unfit for human consumption. This has been kind of raising the alarm of different organizations, saying the World Bank and the UN and other organizations kind of raising the alarm and saying the situation is unbearable, it's unfit for human consumption, water is unfit for human consumption, or whether that Gaza is unlivable. But we're not, and the whole kind of framing of the issue was quite problematic, because Gaza itself is not, it's not natural for it to be unfit for human consumption, unfit for human life. And it was also because the underlying reality on the ground was a settler colonial structure that has been aided and abated by these international agencies kind of pushing on framings like, oh, we can solve the water issues in the Gaza Strip, or we can solve the water issues in the West Bank. How do we do that? It's not a justice-based perspective. It's not about, reclaiming Palestinian rights to their resources, reclaiming that relationship that Yasmeen spoke about, that relationship of care and taking care of the environment and being part and parcel of it, like reclaiming those rights for the environment. It was about finding techno-managerial solution, right? So we can propose desalination for Gaza, but also keeping the siege on Gaza, but let's build desalination plants for a population that doesn't have access to any energy sources or fuel, that is highly dependent on an occupying power, right? So these type of questions, for me at least, I began kind of to confront by speaking about water in the different geographies of Palestine, and kind of situation being that of injustice overall, that this is a structural issue of a settler colonial entity that is here to transform nature, transform relations with nature, and impose a hierarchy of being superior to nature and to people and to kind of any natural existence of human and non-human actors. And I think this is really important to kind of keep in mind as well. So the settler colonial structure, first, like we heard from Yasmeen, we heard also from Sarona, it aims to erase, but also replace and transform relations with the land and people. And it does this through very material things, of course, military occupation, but it also does this through building very exclusionary infrastructure that only serves the settler versus the colonized, or by designing laws and policies to also seem to be abating by law. You know, environmental protection, for example, comes as one law that kind of prevents Palestinians from being on their land for the sake of protecting nature reserves or establishing nature reserves on depopulated villages or in areas of the West Bank where they become really completely closed off from Palestinian existence on it. So these things happen also on much like kind of a multi-layered level. So I think what I wanted to kind of this would be like a bit of reflection and the work that I have been doing, that kind of thinking of the Gaza, West Bank, 1948 lands, Jerusalem as part and parcel of this experience of erasure that is still ongoing. So it's not confined to geographical spaces like the colonizer wants us to think, but also it's not confined to what the international aid agencies wants us to think about. What is an environmental issue in Palestine? How do we address that environmental issues? And then climate change comes to also complicate further the picture, because climate change is also framed in a very apolitical sense. Like, oh, we need to address climate change, but we keep the occupation untouched. You know, we don't address issues of rights, issues of justice, and this kind of becomes the status quo and the normal way of these external actors coming in to kind of impose their idea of like what is climate justice. So this is what I just wanted to say in terms of my intervention, but I wanted to kind of bring it back to us because each of us is working from in a different institutional arrangement. We're also knowledge producers. We raise awareness on different issues, but to what extent have we also been confronting this reality that knowledge about the environment has been very Western-centric, has been very much kind of dominated by mainstream framing, whether it is of climate change or environmental protection, and the idea that only through technological advancements we'll be able to address those environmental issues. So I wanted to kind of maybe reflect each of us quickly about like how does it really influence our work, and to what extent does it serve the Palestinian struggle, and to what extent does it also limit it in some ways where we're required to speak about issues in a very kind of apolitical sense, like, oh, let's address air pollution, but well the root cause is the occupation, and the root cause is the genocide. And so I wanted to hear from, maybe let's do the same kind of like or like let's open
Maybe
it.
Yasmeen and Mohammed might have more
Yes.
experience with that, because luckily I don't really have to deal with that because of the organization. But yeah.
Yeah.
and then
No, sure. And also, yes. So Yasmeen, do you want to kind of tell us a bit from UWAC's perspective, also being an organization that is rooted in ground, it's rooted in kind of community work before the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. So it had this kind of very much grassroots orientation. How do you see also it has been shaped by different agendas, by different framing of the environment and environmental problems that Palestinians face?
Yes, absolutely. You cut out for a little bit earlier, so if you could repeat the question. Sorry.
No, that's all right. We're just trying to kind of frame it in terms of like, how do we also operate in our own different institutions and through our different types of work? How do we situate Palestine and make sure that also it is framed as a struggle, you know, as a struggle for rights, as a struggle for justice, versus being an environmental issue, like versus like framing Palestine as an issue where there are environmental degradation or there is food insecurity, for example, like in the work that you do. How do you confront that, considering that there are many international actors also involved in framing that
Yes,
issue?
absolutely. Oh, so much to say about this one, especially things we've been confronting the past, God, how long has it been? 9 months? when dealing with international actors who are approaching the ongoing crisis, which is humanitarian, environmental, political, ecological, as a humanitarian issue. And as such, trying to sanitize the core of the issue, which is land, as we all know. And the sanitization happens also in the environmental sector, in the food sector, when we're on the international space. And this, of course, the Israeli genocide and the settler colonial occupation have long enacted unimaginable environmental damage on the entire ecosystem, land, sea, air. But it also has an equally long history of greenwashing. And greenwashing is the use of environmental rhetoric, in this case, to cover up its violent colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and the repression of the indigenous Palestinian people. And the military-industrial complex, Israeli, but also American and globally, functions as though it has a sort of environmental exceptionalism. And we see this especially happening with the Israeli settler colonialism of Palestine and during the genocide, which is exacerbating the climate crisis, but they're discussing this as a quote-unquote conflict. There are two sides. This is an unfortunate consequence, as though it's not, as you said, part and parcel of what is happening. And despite all of this, we see the colonizer hailed for environmentalism. Israel attended COP28 while carrying out this catastrophe. And the occupation relies on this greenwashing in order to be able to continue its advocacy. Israel is very often hailed as kind of an environmental leader. And there often is the Israeli occupation, but also other actors will look down on Palestinian mechanisms and methods of engaging with the land. Funny, just yesterday, I was reading a book about how the British, during the British Mandate, the British agricultural ministry was classified a number of Palestinian native plants as weeds, and then carried out a campaign to try to eradicate these native plants, which for Palestinians have a deep historic significance and have multi-usage. But for the colonizers, these were weeds, they were invasive. And this is just one very small example, even before 1948, of how colonialism and settler colonialism is in and of itself invasive to the environment. And so one of the ways that UOC engages in our work of the land, we frame our work through food sovereignty, as I mentioned, and through traditional Palestinian agroecology, where we engage with the land and with everything around us as we are part of it. And that is what drives how the Palestinian farmers also engage with the land. And on the topic of climate change and environmental issues, we also see, this debate on the global scale, which is so silly, of, is climate change even real? Is environmental harm even worth talking about? Where in Palestine, everyday people, farmers, people in my village, my grandma who did not have a formal education in the way that the, Western Academy considers education, she's talking about climate change every day. And she never once studied in a classroom about climate change. So many people in Palestine, the people who engage with the land, are noticing the material and physical impacts of this harm in a way that colonizer epistemological frameworks cannot actually engage with the land in the same way. There are a number of examples of this manifesting. I don't want to take too much time, but yeah, I'm sure the examples will also come up. But I'm interested in hearing what Mohammed has to say also.
Yeah.
I'll. So in a past role, I worked. I'll refer to the presentation because I brought up the PERAC principles, the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict, and this is a culmination of almost 10 years of work by various actors in international humanitarian and environmental law. And I was involved in that work in the early days as a scientific researcher who was tasked with building building a small evidence base to advocate when it came to the environment and conflict. And it was quite an interesting space to be in, because ultimately, I guess I come from a very anti-militaristic perspective. I do not support the military-industrial complex. I think we should really scale down and not have conflicts. But at the same time, we found ourselves talking to people in different defense ministries who were talking about how they were making bullets that didn't have lead, for example, so that they didn't pollute the environment. So, we kill you, but we kill you in an environmentally friendly way. But still, I think the work was, going back to the concept of like knowledge production, the work was interesting because we were able to highlight situations like Agent Orange, Vietnam, use that suffering, bring that experience into the discourse, talking as well about like environmental exposures during the Iraq War and other situations going back to the Second World War, where there pollutants that we left in the sea. So I think like ultimately in that sense, it's kind of trying to create space in a discourse that then creates progress, albeit this is international law that's very, very driven by the interests of the states that come together to make it happen. So it ends up being quite watered down, and we have like an international order that has this exceptionalism for the more powerful states. But I guess maybe we could discuss this further in a bit, but like ultimately, should we still work on things like this? I mean, I think that we should, even if what they say, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, but at the same time, well, we have to work on different fronts.
Yeah. Right.
I can pop in.
Of course.
Thank you. So, just really wanting to, I'm not looking at what's up, I'm looking at my notes. But just like to really carry on what Yasmeen and Mohammed really, I think, effectively illustrated is, I think, something around, how do we make our understanding of Palestine as effective as possible and as grounded within the values of liberation. And I think one of the things that Yasmeen and Mohammed have been really illustrating is the settler colonial attitude towards the land, Israel's attitude towards the land, despite doing things that, attempts to greenwash or purport itself to be an environmental steward through, as Mohammed was saying, we'll kill Palestinians and anyone who stands for their liberation, but we'll do it in a way that, may be vegan, for instance. So just really quickly wanting to maybe flag for people, like 3 attitudes that, Israel really embodies when it talks about settler colonial attitudes towards the land. And the first is that of ownership and domination. So settler colonialism aims to own and dominate the land rather than living in harmony with it. And that's what Yasmeen was really picking up on, which is Palestinians seeing themselves as the caretakers for the land, rather than the land being something that is our property. And we can see this, for example, in how before Europeans colonized the land that is now known as Manhattan Island, it's made up of wetlands and rivers, which the indigenous people designed their architecture and way of life around. And European colonizers built over these wetlands, ignoring the geography and ecosystem. And that's why there's actually been loads of flooding all around New York City in the last few years. And the second attitude is that of extraction. So settler colonialism wants to exploit the land to accumulate wealth and profit. So we can see this, for example, when Dutch and British colonizers went to South Africa to access the country's wealth of natural resources, including diamonds, gold, and iron. So again, whenever we're talking about Palestine, it can be seen as also a microcosm for other places that continued to experience settler colonial violence. And the third is that of manipulation. So this means practices and that deliberately attempt to change the ecosystem to make it fit the settler's vision. So Yasmeen and Mohammed were talking about that. Yasmeen in particular, with her talking about the British designation of weed, or of a plant, into weed. And what is the intention behind that policy, and how does that work to disrupt Palestinians' relationships, not just with each other, but with the land? And just one very quick example of this greenwashing that Yasmeen pointed to, which is that of the organization called the Jewish National Fund, which we can speak to maybe in a bit, but just wanting to flag, it basically uses tree planting as a way of actually having further land grabs across Palestinian territory. So really just to say like colonialism is quite atmospheric. And I think Mohammed's work is actually really showing us that like these pollutants go into our lungs and kill us. And so if it's not immediately the bombs, it's the atmosphere itself.
1%, if I could just
Yeah,
jump
you
onto that. I mean, but also harming their own population as well. Thinking from Gaza particularly, and the way the prevailing winds go, they come from the sea, pass over all the rubble and destruction, and will get to Israeli population centers, also people in the West Bank and elsewhere, depending on the size of the particles. Yeah.
Not only that, and it's like also like because of like successive like assaults on Gaza as well, like there was always like a cutoff of electricity where wastewater plants were not working completely, and a lot of sewage water was kind of being dumped into the sea, and also the currents were like actually bringing it up in Asqalan and other areas too. And so I think one time when we're presenting and somebody asked like, why would they do that? Because if their intention is to kind of colonize, right? To colonize Gaza, and if their intention is to erase Palestinian presence, why would they destroy the environment, right? And this is kind of a very at the core of what you were saying, Kaman, Sarona, like at the end of it, there is this, how do you say, like, superiority of the colonizer in terms of their worldview and in terms of the fact that everything is under their like control. There's a hegemony over land and hegemony over environment, and there is the idea that environment, without being exploited to its optimal extent, is not being it's not being taken advantage of. So the idea that there's always going to be technical solution, that there is capital to kind of compensate. So basically, it's really evident of the way like that colonialism at the end of the day separates between humans and nature and kind of considers it as sites of extraction, whether people or bodies or environments or landscapes or whatever it is. So this is at the heart of it, and there's always kind of this idea that they will solve it. They will find these techno-managerial solutions to address it.
Can I jump in just with a thought? Because Sarona showed the very map, the map that everyone knows of the shrinking amount of Palestinian land in the West Bank and Gaza as well, but in different ways now. Because in the West Bank it's building more and more walls, encroaching more and more on land, and in Gaza now it's just been wholesale destruction. And you were saying about the sewage, and and I was talking about the air pollution and how it affects Israelis as well as Palestinians, but more so Palestinians. One thing to bear in mind there is that the effects on Israel are, I guess, minor inconveniences when it comes to their bigger game. That map of shrinking Palestinian land, the fact that half of Gaza now is unlivable, that means that I guess the Israeli state, the Zionist movement, is happy to take the hit to fulfill the wider goal. Apparently, I think it was Herzl who said about the Zionist movement, even pre-48, they said, we'll build the Israeli state with another acre and another goat, just little by little. And I think it's the same kind of philosophy that's going on, a philosophy of a very long game.
If I could also jump in super quickly. Something that came to mind as you all were talking just now was a specific example of in the West Bank, the village of Safa, which is west of Ramallah. At the moment, the Israeli occupation is building an industrial zone in that village. The village is along the wall, the green line, so the separation wall between 48. There's a settlement right next to it, partially on its land, and a couple of years ago, the occupation began building an industrial zone. Now, the occupying settlement, actually filed a lawsuit to try to prevent the building of this industrial zone because they said that it would have environmental effects that would impact their health. And this Israeli settlement is further from the village, or further from the industrial zone that the village is, because it's being built in the middle, or part in this village. And if the Israeli settlement actually came up and said, we don't want this to be built because it will have harmful effects on our health because of the pollutants into the atmosphere, Of course, the occupation is continuing to build it anyway. The people who are living in this village right next to the industrial zone, imagine the health impacts it will have on them. And this is just one small example of hundreds and hundreds of examples, but the ways that Israeli settlements for decades and decades have been impacting the communities on which they are built, including but not limited to waste dumping, introducing intrusive and invasive species. People are noticing, local communities observe that local plants that grow naturally have disappeared, wild livestock disappears, even natural water springs have disappeared because of the ways that the Israeli settlements have been built. But as you were all saying, this sometimes even affects the settlers themselves. But for a settler colonial entity, that is a small price to pay in order to push out the indigenous population and to ultimately harm that indigenous population. So now as this industrial zone, which is just one small example, continues to be built, it's pushing out the Bedouin communities that live and used to herd in that exact area. It's going to have horrible health impacts on the larger village, and that is going to have domino effect of consequences on the community.
Yes. No, yeah, and that's kind of the domino effect somehow, and kind of the lack of ethics of care as well, that Israel as a settler colony and kind of disregards anything that has to do with kind of really like being on the land and living in harmony with the land. And I think this is really important kind of to see it like on a wider picture when we think of like the environmental movement, the global environmental movement also seems to kind of separate, all these issues of environmental protection or climate change. These are issues that need to be dealt with nation states. Nation states has to decide, and nation states have to be the ones that put the laws and regulations to protect the environment and to reduce carbon emissions, for example. But then kind of always shunning away from addressing kind of the root cause of environmental degradation, which is colonialism, and how it's like the need is for a structural change, not a systematic change, and not just kind of policies here and there. And I just wanted to say that in the latest COP 28, where the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, he compared the genocide that is ongoing in Palestine to the future of countries in the global south in the face of climate crisis. And he said that this is what awaits us. This is a rehearsal for the future. And it's true, kind of, again, how do we, all of us in our different line of work, how do we also, again, center Palestine as like a global struggle? And I know each of us maybe you spoke a bit more like clearly, but it would be nice to see like how do you actually think, like how do we actually situate Palestine as a global struggle, as a justice struggle in our different fields of work? First by maybe like kind of what you, Mohammed, was saying, like maybe engaging with kind of the mainstream discourses or knowledge production in its kind of mainstream way, let's say, where we need to kind of quantify, we need to show evidence, we need to show that, yes, that is the first step, but how do we move beyond? And I think one thing that is quite striking in the way that mainstream media has been talking about Gaza Strip is that, the amount of carbon emissions that kind of came out of the war is this and that. But kind of really that doesn't really, it obfuscates really so many layers of injustice that we don't really, that these numbers don't really talk about. And what about the previous assaults in Gaza? And what about the rest of Palestine as well, and the environmental justice we've been experiencing as Palestinians? So I wanted to kind of see like, okay, how do we actually move beyond? How do we make sure that our contribution and our kind of mobilization in our different roles, how is it moving and how is it building alliances with critical voices, whether climate movement or air pollution studies or food sovereignty and agroecology? So the big question. Maybe we end there and then allow also for like some questions.
Shall I go first? Yeah. Okay. I guess I think it probably starts with building alliances with people who share the same goals. So I think there are many in the environmental movement and like I guess human rights organizations that have been coming out strongly against apartheid, isn't it? Like Amnesty International, I think even I'm not sure if this is right, and someone maybe correct me, Greenpeace, I think, might have even at some point spoken about, sorry, right. And so like building those alliances, I think it's important not to, okay, I can't believe I'm saying this as a scientist, but you know, if we choose to go down like a fully scientific evidence route, then I think we're probably at a disadvantage there. And actually, when it comes to environmental destruction, also like, you know, products that have toxic effects, the opposition, and I'm talking now about like corporations and I guess states that you know, colonial states and imperialist states use scientific uncertainty to further their objectives. So, you know, for example, the example I used of Agent Orange in Vietnam, the evidence was there, but it was uncertain, and they kind of used that uncertainty to say, okay, no, we can do this. So obviously we have to like be armed with strong science, but also we have to be prepared to kind of go beyond that. I think we also have to build broadly. I like the fact that you brought up the carbon emissions. I'll finish here, because I actually think while it is like reductive in the sense that you know, it doesn't in any way describe people suffering in Gaza. I guess like a better statistic for Gaza is like the, you know, 2 or 3 atomic bombs explosive power, I think, is a better one. But if you think about it in a global scale, then I think it's kind of it makes Gaza seem very intersectional in that sense. So I actually think it's a good one to use, but just as how you use it to link with other struggles. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yasmeen?
Yeah, Yasmeen, if you want to come in and
Sure. So UOC is part of, we are a member organization of La Via Campesina. La Via Campesina is the global peasants movement. It is composed of and representative of hundreds of thousands of peasants, farmers, landless people, land workers, indigenous people, all across the world. And it is one of the largest social movements in the world. And La Via Campesina is one of the ways that I feel very fortunate to not only witness but participate in what I see as transformative justice and co-governance, co-leading on an international scale. I really believe that La Via Campesina is internationalism at its best, in a way that is as not only anti-colonial but decolonial, in terms of structure, mechanisms, processes, and equity. And so I would encourage everyone, first and foremost, to look into La Via Campesina and support whatever local organizations or member organizations of it. But through La Via Campesina, we have also been able to connect with other peasants and farmers movements all around the world. And this type of solidarity is active solidarity. And it's not just solidarity in the way that, like, you know, sharing Instagram posts like #solidarity, but it's a joint struggle. And I think reframing solidarity with Palestine as joint struggle can be really critical to thinking about how we shift our positionality. Or for those who are outside of Palestine or who are non-Palestinian, how do you see yourself in relation to Palestine or people who it feels very far away? But viewing it as joint struggle, my liberation is your liberation, is their liberation, is our liberation. And not just on the environmental front. If Palestine is free, we're all free. Because in order for Palestine to be free, so many other things have to happen. And all of those things that have to happen are bad things stop happening. So, you know, if Palestine is free, that means settler colonialism is not present. That's, you know, very broad generalization. But when we think of it in this way, and really emphasizing the human-made constructs, or that borders and separations are constructs they're not natural to the land, and viewing ourselves as a true international movement, joint struggle, I think positioning oneself towards justice and solidarity is much more effective. And the other thing I'll say is You know, we are witnessing right now the largest mass mobilization in the world for Palestine that we have ever seen. And, you know, it shouldn't have had to take this long. It shouldn't have had to, all of this should not have had to happen in order for that mobilization to occur. Unfortunately, here we are. But what I will say is, and I know that there's the encampment happening right now, but the student protests and the student uprising, the student intifada is something that has given so many of us so much hope. And I don't say that lightly. It's been a very challenging time. But, you know, even my grandmother will be watching TV and there will be pictures of student or videos from student encampments. And she'll be like, are those your friends? And I'll, you know, tell her, yeah, those are my friends. But it's been such a beautiful and phenomenal thing to watch and that is the type of mobilization that reaches us, that we need, but also that is a responsibility of everyone, no matter what position you're in. And I think the way that the students have been going about this joint struggle has truly been remarkable and poses a really incredible model. And the very final thing I'll say is, whenever I mentioned my role as international advocacy, and whenever I am speaking with any of the farmers that we work with or the peasants, I'm always asking them, you know, like, is there anything specific you want me to touch upon when I'm talking to people outside? And they always say the same exact thing. They say, "Ta'ziz samudna," support our steadfastness. We are on this land, we will not leave this land, but we need that our steadfastness, this steadfastness that we have that is inherent to us and our land and our relationship with this land, what we need is not charity, it's not pity. What we need is strength. So strength is the call. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Yasmeen. Thank you, Yasmeen. This is such a powerful articulation of what we're all feeling and but then yes, it's a shout out also to the encampments and to the SOAS one in particular, where we are based today, and we're going to also join them later, but hopefully after we're done, we can all go there. But yeah, definitely it's on agency. It's basically what we're saying is that we all have agency, and it has been stripped away from us from different kind of structures and in our different contexts, even outside of Palestine. So it's about reclaiming that agency in the work we do, in what we think, in what we do, in how we consume and how we think. So I think this was really great, Yasmeen, as a kind of wrap up for kind of our conversation. And we'll open it up for discussion. If you have any thing you want to say, questions, or you want to kind of elaborate on any of the points, whatever you feel like, for a few minutes before we
I wanted to ask that Yasmeen mentioned a book which she was reading.
Can you just raise your voice a bit?
Yasmeen mentioned a book which she was reading yesterday about a campaign. I was wondering what the name of it was.
Yasmeen,
Did you hear that question?
Can you repeat it a little bit louder?
You mentioned a book which you were reading yesterday about a campaign. We were talking about greenwashing. I was wondering what the book was called.
Yeah, so yesterday I was reading this book published by Makan Foundation. I don't know if it's a book more that it is like a collection of documents and different works, but it's El-Himniya ala al-Hashaish, or Weed Control. It was published by Makan Foundation in 2020. But I don't know if it's available online, but it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Nice. Please go ahead, but just please try to raise your voice. That would be lovely. Thank you.
My interest is in supply chains. So, just like with anything, if I see some sort of scenario, especially to do with climate change, my brain is thinking, where did it originally start from? Where did the resources come from? Because otherwise, if you're just stuck in this spot, then you can't really see where was the original problem started. So when it came to the Gaza thing, I know about the military-industrial complex. I know that the minerals required for this is coming from different parts of the world.
Sorry, I think it's hard of hearing.
But then in the last few months, I've seen people who are standing up for Palestine, also standing up for climate change. And I thought there's something a bit wrong here. There's something a bit weird saying here, because in my work and research in climate change, when I look at the resources, i.e. the solutions for climate change, which is renewables, I'm not staying somewhere in Europe or London. I end up somewhere in Africa. Because I'm thinking, where did these resources come from? All these resources have come back from Western Africa, or somewhere in India, or somewhere in Pakistan, or somewhere, yeah? And then this Gaza thing, and then I think it was maybe 2 months ago, someone had said, hey, look, one of the bombs or some missile technology that dropped in Palestine was from some British company on aerospace or something like that, British aerospace, which most people know is going to be American and British technology. But most of these resources for the military-industrial complex are coming from the same regions, i.e. minerals-wise, and the same sources of conflict, similar conflict, exactly the same as Palestine. Somewhere in Congo, somewhere in Eastern Africa, somewhere in Burkina Faso, where they've just kicked out the French in the last 12 months, somewhere in maybe South America, somewhere in Pakistan. And I thought, well, hold on, is it possible to be standing up for Palestine, which is good? Also, if you're standing up for climate change, are you standing up for the Congolese people, or are you standing against the Congolese people? Because if you're standing up for climate change, the minerals required to make the bombs and drop them in Palestine are coming directly from Congo. And my question is, as I asked one of the people downstairs, outside here, well, you know, where the space where they've got the tents, the camps, and I says, listen, have you looked at these tenuous links? There was just one guy on the stand that says, have you looked at these tenuous links that maybe some people might be unintentionally contributing one thing to another? And I just wanted to get your thoughts on this. Like when I look at Congo, mass areas of conflict, similar scenarios that's happening is not so visible to us. It's been visible for the last 9 months. Are we actually drawing these links and actually saying the military-industrial complex is visible in Congo, is visible in Haiti, is visible in Palestine? Also, the United Nations. United Nations, I've seen reports on YouTube that United Nations have been instrumental in doing the invasion in Haiti, in onslaught. They've been instrumental in the invasion and illegal occupation for resources in Congo. But when it comes to Palestine, they're standing up for Palestine. And I was like, hold on a second, there's something a bit wrong here. I'm just thinking myself, but then I come here because I want to get other people's opinions to see or verify, and is my thinking right? Or I don't know, just to hack my brain and hack this question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Would you like to come in?
So is the question, sorry, is it, just so I make sure I'm hearing you correctly, is it, if we're talking about like liberation for Palestinians, somehow then that translates into further oppression, maybe unintentionally for other people? My response to that would be no. And the reason for that is because to really frame everything and to practice a true anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, as Yasmeen has been saying, you know, joint struggle, what that would mean is any way in which we are able to de-link from systems of oppression, that would be the way to do so. So it wouldn't necessarily, it would not be to suggest or practice anything that would further exploit not just other peoples, but also the land and the resources and all of that. I think actually Israel does this, where especially within different countries in Africa, where through development deals, it likes to say where it buys out massive debts from different countries. And then what it does is through development is it then further exploits the lands in different countries. So I would say actually Israel does that actually really not nicely, but that's something Israel does as a way of, again, attempting to say it's lending its technology to other places. So I would say that would be my answer, but I don't want
Yeah,
to
and
speak on the
also-
behalf of others.
You want to come in? Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I kind
So
of I agree with your assessment. I'd probably just add to pick up on a point that you made about supporters of Palestine being denying climate change. Is that what you were saying?
Not denying climate change, but if people are actually supporting Palestine, which is you're right. But if people are also saying supporting climate change, could be supporting climate change, and then the solutions for climate change are rooted from the same forms of violence and oppression.
So when you say supporting climate action and therefore looking at alternative technologies, for example, so like kind of battery components. Okay, I see what you mean.
There is, it's like kind of an extension of green colonialism somehow, because these solutions are like premised on the idea of like techno-managerial solutions and the fact that science can like advance our solutions elsewhere, but it's also based on resource exploitation.
Yeah, and I think what I'd probably say to that is that when we look at climate action, we need to think beyond just replacing our exact amount of energy that we need with renewables, because that's just, like as they say, a hiding to nowhere, because we won't have the resources. Whereas if we look across the board at demand reduction, efficiencies, so making sure that you don't just replace all the internal combustion engines with Teslas, you actually reduce the number of vehicles on the road, then you're looking at a world where climate action results in a more globally just society rather than just continuing this consumptive society that we live in.
Yeah, we can maybe extend it like the discussion further, but maybe allow others to come in before the time is a bit tight. So, I have one here. But if you, please can raise your voice, that will help.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if maybe you could say a little bit on in how far especially like organized struggle is maybe connected to also struggles in Rojava. I'm just thinking because of like how Rojava, especially also in an idealized way and simplified way, I think, but like often in like Western spaces of environmental activism, etc., is seen as like this example of environmentally friendly self-organization, etc. And yeah, but I was just wondering if like there's a linkage in the struggles that is particularly present, etc. Because it's also kind of a colonial depossession, etc. Like all of those themes run through both struggles, right? The Kurdish struggle and the Palestinian struggle. So just wondering.
I don't know enough, to be honest, to be able to speak about that confidently. So yeah, I wouldn't feel comfortable answering, but I've written down your question because now I'm gonna go do some research. So thank you for asking it.
I wonder if Yasmeen has any.
Yeah, Yasmeen as well. Yeah, we don't want to exclude you from.
Absolutely. Contribute. Yes, please.
I wish I could say more, but similar to Sarona, I mean, I have a basic understanding of the context, but I don't think I'm able to speak on it enough. But it's an excellent question.
What's your answer? As in, like, what's your opinion?
No, I don't. That's why I'm asking.
No, but like education.
I think what I was also thinking is like I think a lot of like Rojava's economy right now also still depends on like extraction of fossil fuels, etc. Right, and I was kind of thinking about how there's been arguments about Gaza's economy, for example, and like exploitation of oil, like oil fields that obviously Israel doesn't allow them to exploit, like how that would enable them to like strengthen their economy, even though I also think that like if we look at that in terms of like political economy, I don't know if that's exactly true because there's other constraints too, right? But so that duality kind of, I see a parallel there, but yeah.
I'm glad you elaborated more because actually this is something that I was keen on discussing a little bit because, we have the Marine 1 and 2 gas fields off the coast of Gaza and, they're viewed as part, like a real kind of centerpiece of the economic development of any future Palestinian states. And I personally, and I guess I don't want to assume just speak on behalf of everyone, but I personally see that as a catch-22 in my mind. I want Palestine to have economic sovereignty, and I guess that would possibly come through those fossil fuels, but then I don't buy into a world that relies on the extraction of fossil fuels for development. So I guess going back to, I think what Yasmeen was saying about how, I guess, Palestinian liberation needs to come in tandem with more global liberation and better environmental and climate justice. And I think, and this is like a big discussion that we need to have as Palestinians, because I think, Yasmeen, I mean, I guess you're in Palestine right now. Are we a mainstream view in that respect, or an outlier? I hazard the latter.
In terms of what exactly?
Oh, pay attention. In terms of, you know, like looking at kind of the Palestinian struggle being linked to climate justice, and you know, not, you know, thinking of Palestinian liberation not as just perpetuating extractive economies, but rather an economy that goes back to, I guess, the roots of a good relationship with the land and the environment.
No, I think in different terminology and with different vocabulary than perhaps the Western Academy utilizes, but it's, I think what we all are talking about right now is the pretty broad perspective. I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone, of course, but in terms of the, you know, land workers, peasants, farmers, fisher people, Palestinian rural communities at large are noticing the ways, and not just noticing, but living the consequences of extraction and of climate change, of environmental disaster on a daily basis. The heat that is hitting Palestine right now is significantly worse than it was 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, 20 years ago. The olive harvest, the way that the olive harvest has decreased over the years. The fruits, I keep referencing my grandmother, but my grandma has a garden, and half the trees now don't bear fruit. Nothing has changed except for the climate.
Definitely.
Except for, yeah, so I definitely say it's not because people read about it, but because people live it.
No.
Can I just ask just a follow-up?
Just
a quick one.
Just because
But
we
what-
take the last
okay,
question, then
But
after.
what about like the Palestinian Authority, the urban elites? Are they on that page as well?
I don't know if I should speak.
All right.
No, but I think,
It's fine, it can be a rhetorical
I
question.
think at the essence or at the heart of this question is that the fact that there are like actors that have dominated kind of the economy and also kind of our conception of, you know, how do we move forward in this world of catastrophe and crisis, you know? And for so long, our knowledge base, the knowledge base that Yasmeen talks about, the ancestral knowledge, has been completely out of the picture and depicted, even if it's like at the best case scenario, as kind of being inclusive, if like COP actually invites, you know, representatives of indigenous communities or local communities, all like a facade or only like just very performative. But at the heart of it is that, yes, like we need to think of like restructuring of our economy, because economies of solidarity do exist and have been a part and parcel of how indigenous people survived. So it's there, like the roots are there, the knowledge base is there, but it's also about kind of making sure that not only our voices is heard, but also that we get to decide. What Mohammed was saying was really important, like who gets to decide, who gets to sit down and speak about, you know, the prospects for like the Gaza, the gas field, for example. And there are like many examples in the global north where indigenous communities are actually taking the lead in kind of leading on like alternative energy projects, for example, solar energy plants. Or whether it's wind farms, or so it's not about, again, about the technology or the economies of those solutions, but it's also how do we make sure that these economies actually work for the betterment of society and for societies to reclaim their part in the process. Yeah, and it's a complicated question, but it kind of goes back to the essence that agency is there and knowledge base is there, and we need to kind of transform the economies rather than think about it in black and white, like, oh, we need to kind of switch to green energy, but that green energy is actually very much imbued in green colonialism. And it's not that simple.
I don't know if there's time for if I can add something to that.
I think if we need to really leave the room or in 5 minutes, let's say.
Take maybe one more question.
Yeah, exactly. We'll take the last question. But Yasmeen, if you want to do the final reflection on this question, and then we'll have a last question.
Perfect. I was just going to say, because you said solidarity economy, there's a growing social solidarity economy, particularly in regards to youth agricultural cooperatives, that are really wonderful here in Palestine, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And we can research more about that, but also in regards to economic policies, the neoliberal economic model that has been exported and imported into Palestine, excuse me, and propagated by, certain urban elites and political actors that I will not talk too much about, but those are contradictory to the social solidarity economic model that historically Palestinian communities have been organized around community-based economies.
Thank you. Sorry, lastly, your
Yeah, my question. So basically, I work in the environmental sector, and I would say the majority of them, at least in the UK, are very hypocritical in that they don't, especially about Palestine, don't talk about anything that goes on there. They haven't released statements. It's always too political. And when I try and bring it up in the workplace, they're like, we can't talk about that because they get funding from certain organizations. So it's always a really hard place to be in. I was wondering how other people who work in the sector, how are we supposed to frame this so that they realize how objective it is, that it is objectively a climate issue in Palestine, that it's not even a personal opinion. That's kind of one question. Also, whether there is a point to do that, because I know you talked about kind of working within the system. Is there a point of working within the system, or should we just be making our own systems and our own organizations that have those fundamental values already?
Lovely set of questions. I think it's nice also for a chance for each of the speakers to kind of also wrap up, kind of maybe a bit of a hopeful message, or kind of an action oriented takeaway.
This is exactly actually what Makan's been doing, specifically in acceleration since October. But we've been really working with other organizations who already have political linings, such as Tipping Point, Friends of the Earth, Yasmeen's organization, for example. I got to meet her in Paris last year because of a conference. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to meet. But I think something that Makan has been doing through transformative education is actually going into organizations and giving them transformative educational workshops. What can you do from where you are with what you have? How do you shift strategic partners to get them to really understand that if they want to do their work meaningfully, that Palestine can't be an exception. I think part of our responsibility is de-exceptionalizing Palestine, but also really showing people that they're the ones being left behind if they're not talking about Palestine and not getting on board with this struggle. Because I think, as Yasmeen was saying, this is the largest mass mobilization for Palestine we've ever seen. And I think it's really important we also show people that if they're not on board already, they're the ones going to be left behind. So I'm happy to chat with you afterwards, because we've been going into places and giving them that education. But that's one way you can contribute to the movement, is using education.
Okay. Just to add to that, depending on the sector that you're in, I'd say join your union and put forward motions within your unions. I guess there's strength in unity. That's what we've been talking about all along. So get involved in a union sense. I guess that's what I want to do in my field of work in terms of changing from within. But I have, I guess, no illusion about the how practical changing from within is, and we have to kind of also build the movement outside, because that's where the real pressure comes from.
I'd say it's just very lastly, centering Palestinian knowledge production, like the organization Yasmeen works for, is, as she said, they've been criminalized by the Israeli state. Like, it's really important for us to center and make sure we keep these institutions running to the best of our ability, centering Palestinian farmers, land caretakers. So I would say as well, doing that, using Palestinian resources. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. And on that note, we want to really thank you, excellent speakers. And it was really like not only really insightful, but also very powerful. Like Mohammed said, to have a panel of Palestinians speaking on this issue of the urgency of kind of centering justice as well in the heart of what we do, especially the environmental work. So thank you so much also for your great contributions, and we invite you also. We're going to be walking down to the encampment just to also show solidarity. We try to make it happen, but at least this is the least we can do. But if you would like to continue kind of chat on the side with any of the speakers, please join us, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you all so much.
Hope you rest well as well, please. No more.
Yeah, salamtek.
No more webinars.
Salimkum. Yalla, bye. Take care.
Thank you, Gishan.
Such rebels.
I'm not just saw.
And like I went on
Yeah,
just like everything they said to me.
if you send this email, that comes directly to my boss.